I came to celebrate the biggest night of my husband's career. Instead, a young hostess smiled politely and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, you're not on the guest list." 30 seconds later, security escorted me out of the ballroom like I was a complete stranger. I didn't argue. I turned around, walked to my car, and sent one text message. Less than an hour later, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Then my doorbell rang. The engraved fountain pen sat carefully wrapped inside a navy blue gift box on the passenger seat beside me as I drove toward downtown Indianapolis. I glanced at it every time I stopped at a red light, smiling to myself despite the traffic. Michael had admired that vintage Parker duofold for years whenever we wandered through antique shops on quiet Saturday mornings. I had finally found one in beautiful condition, then paid extra to have today's date engraved beneath the clip. The day he became CEO. Or at least that was how I had imagined remembering this evening. The valet greeted me with a cheerful smile outside the Meridian Grand Hotel. The lobby buzzed with conversation, polished shoes clicked across marble floors, and servers carried silver trays filled with sparkling water and champagne toward the ballroom. Everywhere I looked, people wore the confident expressions that seemed to accompany expensive suits and successful careers. I recognized several faces immediately. Old suppliers, former employees, a retired warehouse manager who had worked with us nearly 25 years. A state senator Michael had recently met. Many smiled politely as they walked past me, though most seemed surprised that I had arrived alone. Michael had left 3 hours earlier because he needed photographs with the board before the ceremony. He kissed my forehead before walking out the front door that morning. "I'll see you tonight," he'd said. Nothing about his voice suggested anything unusual. I smoothed my navy dress, the one he'd bought for our 30th wedding anniversary, and walked confidently toward the registration table. A young woman wearing a gold conference badge looked up. "Good evening." "Linda Harper." Her fingers danced across the keyboard, then stopped. "I'm sorry, could you spell your last name?" "Harper." She searched again. Her smile faded ever so slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't seem to have your reservation." I laughed softly. "That's all right, I'm Michael Harper's wife." "I understand." She searched a third time. "Nothing." "I'm terribly sorry. Would you mind waiting just a moment?" She disappeared through a side door. The knot in my stomach tightened, not from fear but confusion. Perhaps someone had accidentally entered my maiden name. Perhaps my invitation had been omitted during registration. It happened. After all these years helping organize corporate dinners myself, I knew mistakes could happen. The young woman returned with a middle-aged man wearing an event manager's badge. His expression was careful, professional, practiced. "Mrs. Harper?" "Yes." "I'm afraid your name isn't on tonight's approved guest list." I smiled politely. "There must be some misunderstanding. I'm Michael Harper's wife." He hesitated long enough for me to notice. Then he quietly reached for the radio clipped to his belt. "Could I have security join us at the front entrance?" The words echoed far louder than they should have. Within moments, 2 security officers approached. Neither looked aggressive. If anything, they looked uncomfortable. One of them, a gray-haired man about my age, lowered his voice. "Ma'am, we've confirmed the guest list." I looked directly into his eyes. "Would you please tell my husband I'm here?" He pressed a finger against his earpiece, listened for several seconds, then nodded almost imperceptibly. When he looked back at me, I already knew the answer. "I'm sorry." He swallowed. "Mr. Harper personally approved tonight's guest list." For a heartbeat, the sounds around me disappeared. I turned toward the ballroom. Through the open doors, I could see crystal chandeliers, round tables dressed in white linen, and a giant screen displaying photographs from Michael's career. Then I saw him. He was standing near the stage laughing with members of the board. His eyes drifted toward the entrance. Toward me. For one impossible second, our eyes met. Recognition flashed across his face. Then, he turned away. No surprise. No confusion. No attempt to come over. Just a deliberate turn of his shoulders as he resumed his conversation. That hurt more than anything the security guard could have said. The older officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, if you'll come with us. I nodded. I understand. Neither guard touched me. They simply walked beside me as we crossed the lobby. Conversation softened around us. I caught curious glances, whispered questions, and one familiar vendor whose face filled with embarrassment before he quickly looked away. Outside, the warm Indiana evening wrapped around me. I thanked both security officers for treating me with respect. The older one quietly replied, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." So am I. I climbed into my car, closed the door, and rested both hands on the steering wheel. I stared at the glowing ballroom windows for nearly a full minute. Then I picked up my phone. One message. One sentence. Freeze the Harper Family Trust immediately. Less than 10 seconds later, David Reynolds replied, "Linda, are you absolutely certain?" I looked back at the ballroom one last time. Then I typed a single word. Yes. The first call came before I had even pulled away from the curb. Michael. I let it ring. The second call came from David, then Harold Bennett, the board chairman, followed by 2 numbers I did not recognize. By the time I reached Washington Street, my phone had vibrated so many times against the cup holder that I finally switched it to silent. Downtown lights slid across the windshield as I drove home, and with every block, another memory surfaced. When Michael and I started Harper Freight Services in 1992, there was no ballroom, no board, and certainly no political guest list. There was a rented office over a tire shop, one dented box truck, and an IBM Selectric typewriter that jammed whenever the weather turned humid. Michael found customers. I kept us alive. I typed invoices after dinner, balanced payroll at the kitchen table, and called vendors at 7 in the morning to ask for another week. When fuel prices jumped and 3 clients paid late, I sold bonds my father had left me and put the money into the company without hesitation. Michael cried that night. He held my hands and said, "Someday everyone will know what you did." I believed him. Years later, when his father suffered a stroke, I stepped back from daily operations because someone had to drive Frank to therapy, organize his medications, and sit with him through the long afternoons when he forgot where he was. Then Emily had twins, and I became the dependable grandmother who picked them up from preschool when her hospital shifts ran late. I did not disappear. I simply became useful in ways no annual report could measure. By the time I turned onto our quiet street in Meridian Hills, the old story had apparently been rewritten without me. Emily's SUV was parked in the driveway. She stood on the front porch in navy scrubs beneath a tan coat, her hair still pinned up from work. The moment I stepped out of my car, she came down the walkway. "Mom," her face told me she already knew. I unlocked the door and we went inside. The house smelled faintly of the cinnamon candle I had lit before leaving. On the kitchen counter sat the casserole I had prepared for the next day, covered neatly in foil, as if ordinary life had not just split open. Emily placed a glossy program on the table. I left as soon as I found out what happened. I opened it. On the second page was Michael's photograph beneath the words, "Founder, visionary, builder of the Harper legacy." There was no mention of me. Not in the company history, not in the acknowledgments, not even in the timeline. "He told people you didn't like these events," Emily said. "He said you preferred to stay home." I folded the program carefully because tearing it would have given it too much power. My phone lit up again with Michael's name. Emily watched me ignore it. Then she whispered, "There's something else." I looked at her. She took a slow breath. I heard Dad talking to Vanessa behind the stage. He said after tonight, they wouldn't have to hide anymore. The room went very still. "Hide what?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Their relationship." Emily's words lingered in the kitchen long after she stopped speaking. "Their relationship." I repeated the phrase quietly. Not because I hadn't heard her, but because saying it aloud somehow made it real. She sat across from me at the breakfast table where we'd celebrated birthdays, wrapped Christmas presents, and once spent an entire weekend assembling science fair projects. Tonight, neither of us touched the coffee I'd poured. "When did you find out?" I asked. "About 2 months ago." She stared down at her hands. I was at a nursing conference in Carmel. Dad said he was meeting a supplier nearby. I walked into the hotel restaurant and saw them together. They weren't acting like coworkers. You didn't tell me. Her eyes filled with tears. I wanted to. I almost called you that night. But Dad swore you already knew the marriage was over, that the two of you were just waiting for the right time. I nodded slowly. He lied to you. I know that now. She reached across the table and took my hand. I'm so sorry, Mom. I squeezed her fingers. This isn't your burden to carry. It would have been easy to collapse into anger, but exhaustion settled over me instead. 34 years of marriage don't disappear in one evening. They unravel thread by thread, often long before anyone notices the fabric coming apart. My phone buzzed again. Michael? This time I answered. Linda, what the hell are you doing? His voice wasn't worried. It was furious. I assume you're calling about the trust? You froze everything. Do you have any idea what you've done? I know exactly what I've done. You're embarrassing me in front of the board. I looked around the kitchen we'd remodeled together 15 years earlier. No, Michael, you embarrassed me in front of the entire company. Silence. Then he exhaled sharply. Vanessa thought it would be awkward if you came. So she removed me from the guest list? I approved it. The words landed with astonishing calm. No excuses. No denial. I didn't want unnecessary drama tonight, he continued. People expect the new CEO to project stability. And your wife of 34 years threatened that image? You haven't been involved with the business for years. I almost laughed. I stopped coming to the office because your father needed full-time care. Then our daughter needed help with her children. You thanked me for making those sacrifices. That was different. No, I said quietly. It was exactly the same, only now you've decided those years don't count. He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted to business. You're holding up a succession plan, Linda. Hundreds of employees are depending on this. I haven't canceled anything. I've paused it until I understand why someone thought they could erase both my marriage and my ownership with a guest list. He muttered something under his breath. Then the line went dead. 5 minutes later, David called. I've reviewed the corporate file, he said carefully. Linda, there's something you need to know. What is it? 3 months ago, paperwork was submitted requesting temporary transfer of the trust's voting authority. My heart slowed. I never signed anything. I know. He paused. The signature on file doesn't look quite right. Outside, rain finally began tapping against the kitchen windows. For the first time that night, I realized this wasn't simply an affair. Someone had tried to replace my voice with a signature that wasn't mine. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image. Michael looking straight at me from inside that ballroom, recognizing me, then turning away as though 34 years together could be dismissed with a slight movement of his shoulders. By 6:30 the next morning, I was sitting across from David Reynolds in the conference room of his law office overlooking Monument Circle. He slid a thick folder across the polished walnut table. I've already notified Harold Bennett, he said. The board agreed to meet at 9. I nodded. Good. David studied my face for a moment. You don't have to do this today if you're not ready. I almost smiled. I've spent most of my adult life getting ready for difficult days. The Harper Family Trust had never existed to give me power over Michael. My father insisted on creating it after investing in our company decades earlier. He believed success could change people, and he wanted safeguards that protected both the business and the family if emotion ever clouded judgment. At the time, Michael had agreed without hesitation. Neither of us imagined we'd someday be sitting on opposite sides of the same conference table. The board meeting began exactly on time. Harold Bennett, now 68 with neatly combed silver hair, looked tired as he called the meeting to order. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. So do I answered. Michael arrived moments later. His expensive charcoal suit looked immaculate, but the confidence he wore so naturally had developed small cracks overnight. Vanessa followed him into the room without making eye contact with me. Michael didn't acknowledge me either. David summarized the legal situation first. The Harper Family Trust has exercised its contractual right to suspend approval of the CEO succession package pending further review. The room remained silent. Then Harold looked toward Michael. Would you like to explain why Mrs. Harper was removed from last night's event? Michael shifted in his chair. It was a personal matter. No, Harold replied evenly. Once security removed a controlling trustee from a company event celebrating a leadership transition, it became a corporate matter. Michael's jaw tightened. The chief financial officer, Marianne Ellis, cleared her throat. There are additional concerns. She distributed several printed spreadsheets. As part of preparing closing documents, we identified executive expenses requiring clarification. She pointed to highlighted entries. Luxury hotel charges in Naples, Florida. A year-long condominium lease. Consulting payments awarded to a marketing firm owned by Vanessa's brother. Executive relocation expenses approved months before the board had voted on Michael's promotion. Michael leaned forward immediately. Those were legitimate business expenditures. No one is making accusations, Harold said calmly. We're asking questions. I spoke for the first time. I don't want assumptions. I want an independent audit. If every expense is legitimate, the records will prove it. Harold nodded slowly. I agree. One by one, the remaining directors voted. Every hand went up, including Harold's. He looked toward Michael with unmistakable disappointment. Until the audit is complete, your appointment as CEO is suspended, and you're being placed on administrative leave. For the first time since I'd met him at 19 years old, my husband looked genuinely afraid. Not because he had lost a title. Because the story he'd spent years rewriting had just stopped being the only version anyone believed. By the following Tuesday, the company felt less like a business and more like a courtroom. Every hallway conversation stopped when someone walked by. Every email seemed to carry more weight than it should have. Rumors spread faster than facts, and I refused to contribute to either one. David called just after breakfast. The forensic document examiner has finished the preliminary review. I set down my coffee. And? He's confident enough to say the signature on the trust authorization wasn't written by you. I closed my eyes. Hearing it confirmed didn't bring relief. It brought something heavier. Someone had decided that my consent wasn't worth asking for. Can he prove who did it? Not yet, David replied, but the electronic file originated from a computer assigned to corporate communications. Vanessa's department. Not proof. But no longer coincidence. Later that afternoon, David arranged for me to use a small conference room at his office. He said someone wanted to speak with me privately. When Vanessa walked through the door, she looked nothing like the polished executive I had seen in magazine photographs beside Michael. Her makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion in her face. She stood awkwardly for a moment. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I wanted to hear what you had to say. She sat across from me, folding her hands tightly together. I didn't know everything. I didn't answer. I know you probably don't believe that. I haven't decided what I believe yet. She nodded slowly. Michael told me your marriage had been over for years. He said you were happier staying home with your grandchildren, that you'd already agreed to step away from the company, and that once the CEO announcement was finished, the divorce would be handled quietly. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed. Not dishonest. Just painfully incomplete. He said you didn't like public events, she continued. He told me inviting you would only make everyone uncomfortable. So you removed my name. A tear slipped down her cheek. Yes. And Michael knew? She looked directly at me. He approved it. The words hurt less than I expected. Perhaps because I already knew. What about the trust paperwork? Vanessa hesitated. I never signed your name. That wasn't my question. She lowered her eyes. I was asked to gather copies of older corporate documents that contained your signature. Who asked? She swallowed. Michael. The room fell silent. She wasn't accusing him of forgery. Neither was she protecting him. She was simply telling me exactly what she had done. I thought it was for record-keeping, she whispered. Looking back, I realize I stopped asking questions because I liked the answers I was getting. That, more than anything, sounded true. After several quiet moments, I asked something she clearly didn't expect. Did Michael ever tell you about 1998? She frowned. No. The year Harper Freight almost collapsed. She shook her head. He never mentioned it. I smiled sadly. Of course he didn't. I looked out the office window toward the Indianapolis skyline, remembering another spring afternoon nearly 3 decades earlier. We were 3 weeks from bankruptcy. 2 major clients had folded, fuel prices exploded, and the bank refused another extension. Michael was ready to shut the doors. Vanessa listened without interrupting. My father had left me a modest investment portfolio. I sold almost all of it and loaned the company enough money to survive. You? Yes. I laughed softly. The funny thing is, Michael cried when I handed him the cashier's check. He promised he'd spend the rest of his life making sure no one forgot what I'd done. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Vanessa whispered, I never knew. I believe you. When she stood to leave, she paused at the door. For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry. I think you are. After she left, David stepped back into the room. The buyer's representatives just called. I looked at him. They're concerned about the audit. I expected that. They're also asking whether you'd be willing to negotiate directly with them. That surprised me. Why me? David smiled faintly. Because they've concluded you're the only person everyone still trusts. David's words stayed with me all the way home. You're the only person everyone still trusts. I didn't feel powerful. I felt tired. For years, I'd believed that if I quietly did the right thing, eventually the truth would speak for itself. Now I was learning something different. Truth doesn't always speak. Sometimes it waits for someone to give it a voice. The buyer's representatives wanted to meet the following morning at their Indianapolis office. Before I agreed, I asked David to arrange something else first. I want to visit the warehouse. He looked surprised. The original one? Yes. Harper Freight had expanded into 4 distribution centers across Indiana, but the old warehouse on the south side was where everything had begun. The faded brick building had been renovated several times, yet the smell of cardboard, diesel, and coffee was exactly the same as I remembered. When I walked through the loading bay, conversations slowed. Then a familiar voice called out, Mrs. Harper? I turned and smiled. Tom Alvarez. Tom had started driving for us 28 years earlier. His hair had turned completely gray, and his knees were a little slower, but his handshake was as firm as ever. I heard you might stop by. Word traveled fast. Soon, 6 employees gathered around. Not because they wanted gossip, because they wanted answers. I gave them only the truth. The company isn't closing. A few shoulders relaxed. The audit is still underway. Someone asked, Is Mr. Harper coming back? I honestly don't know. No one pressed me further. Instead, Tom quietly said, We just want to know whether our pensions are safe. That question hit me harder than anything Michael had said. Not promotions. Not executive titles. Retirement. College tuition for grandchildren. Health insurance. Real lives. Later, the warehouse supervisor, Denise Carter, pulled me aside. There's something you should probably see. She handed me a folder containing draft organizational charts that had accidentally been printed on the warehouse copier weeks earlier. Several names had yellow highlights beside them. Most belonged to employees over 58. Beside each name was the same note. Position eliminated after transition. I slowly turned another page. Another list. More names. Drivers. Dispatch supervisors. Maintenance mechanics. People who had devoted decades to the company. My chest tightened. They've given this to everyone? I asked. Denise shook her head. No, Michael said it was only preliminary. I closed the folder. Whatever happened between Michael and me belonged in our marriage. This did not. That afternoon, I met with the acquisition firm's senior vice president, Rebecca Lawson. She was direct. We still want to purchase Harper Freight. But not if the transition creates years of litigation. I nodded. I understand. She leaned forward. What would it take for you to support the acquisition? I had spent most of the night thinking about that question. My conditions aren't complicated. She waited. No layoffs for at least 2 years. She made a note. Existing pension commitments remain fully funded. Another note. Healthcare stays intact. She nodded again. And no executive restructuring that targets older employees simply because they're close to retirement. Rebecca looked at me for several long seconds. Those aren't financial demands. No. They're employee protections. Exactly. She smiled for the first time. I think we can work with that. When I returned home that evening, another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. A petition. Michael had officially filed for divorce. Along with it came a request asking the court to grant him temporary authority over the Harper Family Trust while the divorce proceeded. I read every page carefully. Then I called David. He really believes this will work. I don't think he believes it, David replied quietly. I think he's desperate. 3 days later, we stood before a county judge. Michael barely looked at me. His attorney argued that because I had stepped away from daily operations years earlier, control of the trust should temporarily transfer to Michael so the business could function normally. David calmly produced 30 years of trust documents, board minutes, and financial records. The judge reviewed them carefully, then looked over his glasses. Mrs. Harper never relinquished her authority. He closed the file. Request denied. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited across the street. Michael caught up with me before I reached my car. Linda. I stopped. His voice sounded strangely empty. Why are you doing this? I looked at him for a long moment, then answered as honestly as I could. Because I finally stopped believing your version of our story. He had no reply. As I drove away, David called once more. The buyers have made a decision. What decision? They don't want Michael leading the negotiations anymore. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. They've asked if you'll represent the trust instead. The next morning, I walked into the buyer's downtown office carrying a yellow legal pad instead of a briefcase. Rebecca Lawson greeted me with a firm handshake. I'm glad you came. So am I replied. I'd rather solve this than spend the next 2 years in court. She smiled. That's exactly what we were hoping to hear. The conference room overlooked the Indianapolis skyline. Glass towers reflected the morning sun, while traffic moved steadily below. Ordinary people driving to ordinary jobs, completely unaware that the future of a company employing hundreds of Hoosiers was being decided several stories above them. Rebecca slid a revised proposal across the table. We've reviewed your conditions. I read every page carefully. Nothing had taught me more over the past week than the importance of slowing down. No layoffs for 24 months, I read aloud. She nodded. Correct. Existing pension obligations remain fully funded. Yes. No reduction in retiree health care benefits. Guaranteed. I continued reading. A new tuition assistance program for employees' children. Enhanced severance protections after the 2-year employment guarantee. Independent oversight during the leadership transition. I looked up. This is much better. Rebecca folded her hands. We build long-term businesses. Keeping experienced employees is worth more than replacing them. I couldn't help thinking how differently Michael would have viewed the same people. He had begun seeing seasoned employees as expenses instead of assets. Somewhere along the way, ambition had replaced gratitude. I'll recommend these terms, I said. Rebecca hesitated. There's one more condition. I raised an eyebrow. Mr. Harper cannot return as CEO after closing. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I disagreed, but because hearing it spoken aloud carried a finality I hadn't fully accepted. I understand. When the meeting ended, David walked beside me to the parking garage. How are you holding up? I laughed softly. I keep waiting to feel victorious. And? I don't. He nodded knowingly. Justice and celebration aren't always the same thing. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call. Vanessa. I know I have no right to ask, she said quietly, but could we meet one more time? We chose a small coffee shop on the north side of town. She arrived without makeup, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of tailored business clothes. "I resigned this morning." I wasn't surprised. They accepted it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I've spent the last several days thinking about the kind of person I became." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, she reached into her purse and handed me a flash drive. "What's this?" "Expense records." I looked at her. There were transfers I questioned months ago. Michael told me they were confidential executive matters. "You kept copies?" She nodded. I guess part of me knew something wasn't right. I accepted the drive. "Thank you." She looked down. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know. I just couldn't keep pretending none of this was my fault." Her honesty didn't erase what she'd done. But it mattered. As we stood to leave, she said something that stayed with me. "You know what frightened Michael most?" "What?" "He never worried about losing the company." She looked directly into my eyes. "He worried people might finally realize you were the one holding everything together." That evening, David called after reviewing the files Vanessa had provided. The audit team confirmed unauthorized executive reimbursements. "How much?" "Enough to require repayment, but not enough to endanger the company." I exhaled slowly. "Good." He laughed. "Most people would have asked whether it was enough to destroy Michael." "I don't want to destroy him." "I know. I just want the truth to survive him." David was quiet for a moment. "Linda, there's something else." "What is it?" "The auditors discovered several executive accounts were emptied just days before the board meeting." I frowned. "Transferred where?" "We're still tracing everything." My heart sank. Michael hadn't stopped making desperate decisions. He'd simply started making bigger ones. The audit report arrived the following Monday. David didn't email it. He drove it to my house himself. When I opened the front door, he held a thick binder against his chest and gave me a tired smile. I thought this deserved a face-to-face conversation. I invited him into the kitchen, the same kitchen where Michael and I had once planned delivery routes on legal pads and celebrated landing our first national account with frozen pizzas because we couldn't afford anything else. David laid the binder on the table. "The auditors finished over the weekend." I sat down slowly. "Tell me." He opened to the executive summary. "The good news is the company is financially healthy. The acquisition can still move forward." I felt my shoulders loosen. "And the bad news?" He slid a page toward me. "Unauthorized executive reimbursements. Personal travel billed as client development. Luxury accommodations unrelated to company business. Corporate funds used for private expenses tied to Michael's planned relocation. None of it would bankrupt Harper Freight, but all of it violated company policy." "He'll have to repay everything," David said quietly. "The board has already voted." I nodded. "Has Michael seen this?" "An hour ago." "And?" "He didn't argue with the numbers." That surprised me. For years, Michael could explain away almost anything. Silence somehow worried me more. By noon, Harold Bennett called an emergency board meeting. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. No one expected dramatic speeches. No one expected miracles. Only decisions. Harold looked around the room before speaking. "The independent audit is complete." He folded his hands. "Based on its findings, the board unanimously votes to remove Michael Harper permanently from the position of Chief Executive Officer." No applause followed. Only quiet acceptance. Harold continued. "The transition committee will proceed under the revised acquisition agreement negotiated with the Harper Family Trust." It was over. Not with shouting. Not with revenge. Just with a formal vote entered into the corporate record. When the meeting ended, I remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty chair across the table where Michael had spent so many years. Success had once looked effortless on him. Now I wondered whether it had always been hiding something fragile underneath. That evening, Emily stopped by after finishing her shift at the hospital. She looked exhausted. "I saw Dad today." I poured her a cup of tea. "How is he?" She sighed. "I've never seen him like that. She told me Michael's house felt strangely empty. The framed awards were still hanging on the walls, but the confidence that had once filled every room had disappeared. He kept saying everyone betrayed him. I looked down into my own cup. "And what did you tell him?" Emily hesitated. "I told him nobody betrayed him." She swallowed hard. "I told him he betrayed you." Tears filled her eyes. "Not because he fell in love with someone else." She shook her head. "Because he spent years pretending your life never happened." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, "He cried." I closed my eyes. Some part of me had imagined this moment for days. Michael finally facing consequences. Michael finally understanding. Yet hearing that he had broken down didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me mourn the man I thought I'd married. Later that night, my phone rang. "Michael." After a long pause, I answered. His voice sounded older, smaller. "I know I don't deserve your time." "No," I replied honestly. "I just need one meeting." "What for?" "Not to change your mind." He paused. "I need to tell you something before the board finishes everything." I leaned back in my chair. "What could you possibly say now?" His answer came so quietly I almost missed it. "The truth." For the first time since all of this began, I believed he actually meant it. I agreed to meet Michael the next afternoon. Not at our house. Not at the company. We met at the small city park where, years earlier, we'd brought Emily to feed ducks on Saturday mornings. It felt like neutral ground, a place that belonged to memories instead of lawyers. He was already sitting on a weathered wooden bench when I arrived. For a moment, I barely recognized him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by a plain navy jacket and faded jeans. His shoulders seemed lower than I remembered, as though the weight he'd spent years avoiding had finally settled where it belonged. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. I sat on the opposite end of the bench. "You said you wanted to tell me the truth." He nodded. "I do." For several seconds, he stared across the pond. "I didn't fall in love with Vanessa because I was unhappy." I waited. "I fell in love with being admired." His honesty caught me off guard. "When the company grew, people stopped congratulating both of us. They congratulated me." He gave a bitter smile. "And I liked it." The wind rustled through the trees. "Every award had my name on it. Every magazine wanted my picture. Every conference introduced me as the founder. After a while," he shook his head, "I started believing I had built everything myself." I looked at him carefully. "And when did I disappear?" He closed his eyes. "Little by little." He admitted that he had encouraged the public narrative because it made leadership simpler. Investors liked a single face. Reporters preferred one success story. Every time someone omitted my name, he corrected them a little less. "Eventually," he whispered, "I stopped correcting anyone." Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, I asked the question that had lingered since David's phone call. "The trust documents." Michael swallowed. "I never signed your name." "But?" "I asked Vanessa to collect old files with your signature. I told myself it was only in case the attorneys needed reference copies." His voice cracked. "I knew exactly why I wanted them." He didn't deny it. He didn't blame anyone else. I kept telling myself I wouldn't use them. He looked directly at me. "But if David hadn't frozen the trust when he did, I probably would have." The admission hurt more than I expected. Not because the fraud had been completed, but because he had crossed the line in his own mind long before taking the final step. "I became someone I never thought I could become," he said. I believed him. Not because it excused anything. Because I had watched the transformation happen over years without fully recognizing it. He reached into his jacket and handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?" "My resignation from the board." I stared at it. "It's already signed." I should have submitted it before the audit finished. I didn't open the envelope. Instead, I asked, "Why now?" He gave a tired smile. "Because for the first time in years, I don't want to win." As I drove home, I realized something unexpected. I no longer needed Michael to lose. The board would finish its work. The acquisition would close. The company would move forward. None of that depended on my anger anymore. That evening, Harold Bennett called. The directors voted unanimously. I listened quietly. The acquisition agreement is approved. And the employee protections? Every one of them. He paused. We also voted to recognize the original founders at the closing ceremony. I smiled. Founders? Plural. A week later, I stood in the same ballroom where security had escorted me out only days before. This time, Harold stepped to the podium first. Before discussing financial results or the future of the company, he looked directly at the audience. There is one mistake this organization intends to correct. The room became completely silent. He turned toward me. For far too many years, Harper Freight celebrated only one founder. He extended his hand. Mrs. Linda Harper, would you please join me on stage? As I walked forward, hundreds of employees rose to their feet. Not because I had won, because the truth had finally caught up with the story. The closing ceremony lasted less than an hour. The legal documents took months to negotiate. The applause lasted only a few minutes. But what stayed with me wasn't the business deal. It was what happened after everyone stopped clapping. Employees drifted into small groups across the ballroom, talking about retirement plans, new opportunities, and families. For the first time in weeks, no one was whispering. No one was wondering what would happen next. They already knew. The company would survive. That mattered far more than who occupied the corner office. Rebecca Lawson approached me before leaving. I wanted to thank you. For what? You reminded everyone that businesses aren't built by balance sheets. She smiled warmly. They're built by people who keep showing up. I shook her hand. Take care of them. We will. Before she walked away, she added one final sentence. I think your husband forgot he inherited a company long before he tried to lead one. I thought about those words all afternoon. She was right. Michael hadn't inherited money. He had inherited trust. And that was the one thing he could never earn back once he spent it. A month later, the divorce was finalized. There was no dramatic courtroom confrontation. No last-minute speech. No attempt to reconcile. We divided our lives the same way we divided our assets, with paperwork, signatures, and long silences.